All right, so we've learned about all the vertebrae and the sacrum and coccyx, that whole vertebral column. Now let's talk about the ribs and the sternum, all the things that make up the rib cage. Humans have 12 ribs on either side, so a total of 24. The first 7 are called true ribs. The next 5 are called false ribs, and the bottom 2 are called floating ribs. Why is that? Hang on, let's explain. So the true ribs have their own cartilage that connects to the sternum. So you can see here's rib number 1, and this piece right here is called the costal cartilage. Remember, costal means ribs. So the costal cartilage connects the rib to the sternum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 all have their own band of cartilage that connects to the sternum. 8, 9, and 10 are false ribs because they share the costal cartilage of rib number 7. They don't have their own connection to the sternum. And then ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs because they don't connect to the sternum at all. Okay, they have no cartilage to connect to the sternum. So that's why we have these terminologies. Now the sternum itself is a long bone, goes down the middle and protects the heart. Remember, the heart sits right behind the sternum in the middle. Yes, I know. The apex goes a little bit to the left. The main part is called the body of the sternum. The top part is called the manubrium. And then down at the bottom, there's this little xiphoid process. So yes, it's spelled with an X, but it's pronounced xiphoid. In young people, the xiphoid process is usually still cartilage, begins to ossify or turn into bone at about age 40. On either side of the top of the manubrium are clavicular notches, and then between them, there's what we call the suprasternal notch. Supra meaning on top of. So the suprasternal notch is on top of the sternum. And you can actually feel this little indentation right at the bottom of your neck, top of your rib cage. Yeah, you can feel that little notch right there. And if you put your finger there into that suprasternal notch and then raise your shoulders, you will feel the clavicles moving in those clavicular notches. Rib number 1 articulates into those clavicular notches, and then these other notches are for other ribs to articulate. The sternal angle here is this line where the manubrium and the body of the sternum join. That's where rib number 2 articulates. And then the other costal notches are for other ribs to articulate, or at least the costal cartilage, not the rib directly. Remember, there's always a cartilage between the rib and the sternum. And that's important because it enables a lot of movement of the rib cage. So if you put your hands on the side of your chest and take a deep breath in, you will actually feel your rib cage expand, and that's how you breathe. You actually make the thoracic cavity larger. So we need to have some flexibility in the rib cage to expand that thoracic cavity. Now, this one shows a foramen in the sternum. It may be present, it may not be present. You may never know that you had a sternal foramen if you haven't had a chest x-ray. It's just a developmental leftover. The sternum develops first as 2 bones, 2 sternal bars during fetal development, and they then fuse together throughout development to create the sternum. If they don't fuse together all the way, then you end up with a sternal foramen. Okay, now the ribs themselves are these curved bones, very thin, and they have a head that articulates with the vertebrae, and then at the other end, a blunt end that joins with the costal cartilage. The neck of the rib is not really narrower, it's just next to the head. The head on the surface of it has articular facets that articulate with the demicostal facet on one vertebra and the costal facet on the body of the next vertebra. Then there is an articular facet on the lateral side or posterior side of the rib that articulates with the costal facet on the transverse process of the vertebra. This sits on a tubercle. Remember, tubercle is sort of a potato-shaped lump. The angle of a rib is the curve of the rib. It is not as angular as the angle of the mandible, okay, but it is a curved area. And then on the medial side of the rib, on the inferior side, there's a little groove where the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve travels to innervate the muscles and the skin of the rib cage. So this is how a rib articulates with the thoracic vertebra. So we're looking from the top. Remember, here's the anterior side, here's the posterior side. So the head of the rib articulates between two vertebrae, and then it actually goes backwards toward the posterior side until the facet on the tubercle of the rib articulates with the costal facet on the transverse foramen. And then the angle of the rib curves around and the rib curves back around toward the front. And that is the end of your axial skeleton. So keep all of that in mind. And let's just review this very quickly. 7 true ribs, 5 false ribs, including 2 floating ribs. And importantly, the difference between true and false ribs. True ribs have their own costal cartilage connecting to the sternum. False ribs share the costal cartilage of rib number 7. And these junctions, these articulations here, and the articulations with the vertebrae in the back are actually movable articulations. We'll talk about when we get to Chapter 9, articulations, that allow for the ribs to move up and out when you inhale to increase the volume inside the thoracic cavity. That is the end of Chapter 7.